degree, resulting in an estimated 15 million deaths. You could go on for much longer, touching on the far-right extremism and fascism in places like Indonesia, Greece, Portugal, and so on. These examples underscore the devastating consequences of right-wing extremism when it captures state power. Whether targeting groups based on ethnicity, religion, race, or ideology, the result has consistently been terror and mass killings. These are just some of the most infamous instances. Okay, now let's take your average left-wing person. If you're left-wing, you've got at least a basic understanding of capitalism and how it is tied to poverty, homelessness, and crime. When you see someone struggling, your instinct isn't to judge them or feel disappointed in their actions. You're asking, what can society do to help them? And empathy is in front and center in your worldview. You'll point out the flaws in the capitalist system, but you're not about to overthrow the whole thing. You're skeptical of revolution, but looking for big changes, and you think we can get there without tearing everything down. You still believe in the current institutions, and maybe you're imagining something like social democracies in Europe, especially those in Scandinavia with stronger social safety nets and fairness baked into society. Look at how popular Bernie Sanders was in 2016 and 2020. That's the kind of left we're talking about here. You're not necessarily diving into Marxist or revolutionary ideas, you're focused on making changes happen within the system as it stands. Now let's take those baseline left-wing ideas to the extreme. They're just as empathetic as your average leftist, but you're a lot more direct and critical about calling out capitalism as the root of the problem. For you, it's not about fixing the system, but overthrowing it. Capitalism isn't just flawed, it's the crux of the problem. And if that means violent revolution, you're ready for it. In fact, most believe that violent revolution might be the only way to remove the ruling class. You probably participate in or organize labor unions, political parties, or activist groups. You're uncompromising in your beliefs, and you have no patience for fascists or racists. Similar to the far right, your ideology can sometimes make you stand out or even feel isolated in mainstream social settings. You might be more out there in terms of appearance with tattoos, piercings, or clothing. Far left groups are typically diverse, and there really isn't an out group. Everyone is generally accepted except for the far right. When it comes to violence, far-left extremists have much different targets and philosophy compared to the far right. They're not out targeting random civilians or marginalized groups. They're going after fascists or the state. Antifa is the common boogeyman and is painted as the worst of leftist extremism, the left's version of a school shooter. Unless you are a fascist or a Nazi, which we can all hopefully agree are universally bad ideologies, you have nothing to fear. Their violence is directed towards fascists so that they can never feel comfortable enough to march openly and attack minority groups. The media would like you to believe horseshoe theory that Antifa violently defending minorities is the equivalent of a mass shooter going into a grocery store and indiscriminately killing minorities. The left extremist goal is an objectively more admirable goal than wholesale massacre. Despite what media might say, far-left violence is almost always directed at specific targets, not innocent random people. The Center for Strategic and International Studies in 2020 revealed that over the previous 25 years, the vast majority of terrorist attacks and plots in the US were perpetrated by far-right attackers. 90% of all terrorism in 2020 alone was right-wing. Of the remaining leftist terrorist attacks, there were acts like assaults, firebombings, and arson. Even environmental protesters sitting on roads or treetops were often registered as acts of terrorism. Actual targeted attacks on individuals with deadly violence from a leftist is exceedingly rare. The most recent prominent case being Luigi Mangione. I'll let you decide for yourself if that violent act is the equivalent to a right-wing person targeting a random black person or immigrant in a grocery store. I'm not saying you cannot find examples of left-wing extremists killing innocent people, but looking at targets and frequency, it's not even a question of which is worse. Meanwhile, we have constant right-wing attacks year after year to the point where it's a fairly common occurrence. Now, I know what many people associate with the far left, especially Americans, is identity politics. While the far right is fairly universal in their messaging, the far left tends to splinter, particularly with messaging around identity. While all leftists want what's best for everyone in marginalized groups, there can be a large difference in the messaging and way to achieve that. There are broadly two camps. The first method focuses on universality, meaning focusing on uniting everyone on an equal field and speaking to every group at the same level. There may be specific groups that are struggling more, but the best way to help them is by focusing on raising all working class people's standards together. Hyper-focusing on specific identities only divides the working class and alienates people who would have otherwise been on board with the class struggle. It drives their attention away from class politics to focusing on their racial, gender, and identity differences. In the modern day, this method of messaging is typically divided between Eastern and Western leftists. The former Soviet Union and currently Communist China does not participate in any type of identity politics messaging that you would be familiar with in the West, focusing much more on universalism amongst class. Modern Western leftists tend to focus much more on individual identities and develop specific messaging campaigns and terminology. They attempt the impossible task of trying to accommodate catered messaging to every possible difference between different groups, usually to the dissatisfaction of every group. While this is certainly done in good faith and by well-intentioned people on the left, the alienation that this has done on the working class is undeniable.
The rules specify that when we have a gender non-binary candidate or officer, The non-binary individual is counted as neither male nor female, and the remaining 6 offices must be gender balanced. With the results of the previous 4 elections, our elected officers are currently 2 male and 2 female. In order to be gender balanced, we must elect 1 male, 1 female, and 1 person of any gender.
New wave academic terminology, discourse, and aggressive messaging around marginalized groups can be off-putting and not very accessible for your average working-class person. Western leftists have placed themselves on a tightrope between messaging on universal programs that benefit everyone, while at the same time not wanting to figuratively or literally abandon specific groups. This has undoubtedly contributed to the failure of the left in the West. The right wing capitalizes on this weakness by using working-class people's annoyance with identity politics to vote completely against their best interests and focus on the culture war. Now let's get to the far-left government. Before we get into discussing the far-left government, please take a second to subscribe and like the video. Thank you. Let's look at what happens when these far-left beliefs are held in positions of power. The left's main targets are those who are perpetuating systems of inequality: capitalists, wealthy elites, and landlords. Unlike the far right, where violence is directed downward onto marginalized outgroups, far-left violence is directed upward to those in positions of power. The left's targets are a very small, highly powerful elite and fascists, in stark contrast to the far right's focus on much larger portions of the population, entire ethnicities, religions, immigrants, or those with different sexual orientations. It is undeniably more just to challenge those exploiting others than to persecute individuals based on inherent traits or identity. Far-right governments seek to reinforce or expand existing hierarchies through policies of apartheid, genocide, or ethnic cleansing. Left-wing governments, even when authoritarian, aim to eradicate feudal systems, redistribute land, and eliminate poverty. These goals are intended to benefit the majority, even if they fail in execution. After addressing the atrocities of far-right regimes, it's essential to confront the darker chapters of far-left governments as well. One significant group of victims under far-left regimes have been those perceived as traitors or counter-revolutionaries.
Nice.
These victims, most notably during Stalin's purges, the Cultural Revolution, and the Khmer Rouge genocide, were casualties of paranoia, authoritarianism, and internal power struggles. Undoubtedly, many, if not most of the victims were loyal communists or innocents swept up in the chaos. However, it is crucial to separate these actions from the core tenets of leftist ideology. Nowhere in Marx's works does it advocate for purges, paranoia, or suppression of intellectuals. These killings were products of authoritarianism and power struggles, not intrinsic to leftist ideology. This is a fundamental difference between the far left and far right. These are traits that can manifest in any regime, right-wing or left-wing. To act like these are exclusively communist or left-wing